The sleek skyline of Manhattan glimmered like a field of stars against the deep navy canvas of the night. Miles Atwood, CEO of Atwood Enterprises, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. His reflection stared back at him, a man in his late 30s, sharp jawline, graying temples, and eyes that carried both the weight of empires and the emptiness of unfulfilled desires. The world knew him as the billionaire of tomorrow, a self-made magnate whose vision had transformed industries overnight. But what no one knew, what he carefully concealed, was the hollowness he carried inside. Miles was infertile. No amount of wealth, influence, or advanced medical treatments could change that cruel truth. His phone vibrated on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. He turned to see the screen light up with a message from an unknown number. "You will be a father." His heart skipped a beat. He stared at the words, disbelief washing over him. Another prank? He received these every so often, hopeful claims from those wanting a piece of his fortune. Yet, there was something about this message that froze him in place. It wasn't just the audacity of the statement, it was the certainty in the words, as though the sender knew something he didn't. Miles sank into his chair and dialed the number, his breath uneven. The line rang twice before clicking, but no voice greeted him, only silence. "Who is this?" Miles demanded, his tone sharp. The silence continued, followed by a faint whisper, too indistinct to make out. Then the line went dead. Miles leaned back, the weight of the cryptic message settling on him like an anchor. He tried to dismiss it, convincing himself it was nonsense. But the words lingered in his mind long after he left the office. 2 days later, another message arrived. "You'll know the truth at 8 p.m. tonight. St. Helena's Garden." Miles felt a strange pull, a compulsion he couldn't rationalize. Against his better judgment, he instructed his driver to take him to St. Helena's Garden. It was an unexpected choice of location, a public park nestled in the quieter side of the city, surrounded by cobblestone streets and historic brownstones. Not exactly the setting for clandestine dealings. As Miles arrived, the winter chill bit through his coat. The park was serene under the silver light of the moon. His eyes scanned the empty benches, the bare trees swaying in the wind, and the faint outlines of statues scattered across the garden. "Mr. Atwood," a soft voice called from behind him. He spun around to see a woman emerge from the shadows, her figure partially obscured by the hood of a long coat. She stepped closer, and for a moment, he was struck by her calm confidence. "I believe you've been waiting for this moment," she said, her tone steady. Miles narrowed his eyes. "Who are you? Why did you send those messages?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to him. Her hands were trembling slightly, a crack in her otherwise collected demeanor. "You'll find the answers you need inside," she said. "But first, I need your word that you'll listen to everything I have to say." Why should I?" he countered. "Because your life is about to change, whether you believe it or not." Her words cut through him like ice. Against his instincts, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a child, a boy, no older than 5, with eyes so eerily familiar they made Miles's chest tighten. The child had his dark hair, his unmistakable, piercing gaze. "What is this?" Miles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated before replying. "This is your son." For a moment, Miles could only stare at her, dumbfounded. The photograph shook him to his core. It was impossible, completely impossible, and yet the resemblance was undeniable. "That's not possible," he said, his voice firm despite the knot forming in his throat. "You're mistaken." "You know I'm not," she replied quietly. "But I understand your skepticism. The truth isn't simple." Miles stepped back, his heart pounding. "If this is some elaborate scheme to extort me—" "It's not," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came because he needs you." The intensity in her words silenced him. "Who is he?" Miles asked, his defenses starting to waver. "And how could he possibly be my son?" The woman glanced around, ensuring they were still alone. "His name is Leo," she said, "and he was conceived through a process that shouldn't exist, one that you didn't authorize." Miles's brow furrowed. "You're saying someone used my DNA without my consent?" She nodded solemnly. "It was an experimental procedure, a rogue scientist who wanted to push the boundaries of possibility. They used your genetic material, paired it with a surrogate, and—" Leo was born. The revelation hit Miles like a tidal wave. His mind raced, piecing together the implications. Someone had violated his privacy, his autonomy, and created a life without his knowledge. But beyond the anger and betrayal, there was something else, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" he asked, his voice steadier now. The woman reached into her coat again and produced a stack of documents, medical records, genetic testing, legal files. Miles skimmed them, his hands trembling as the evidence piled up. It was undeniable. Every test confirmed what the photograph had already suggested. "Why now?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "Why wait 5 years to tell me this?" She lowered her gaze, guilt flashing across her face. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what you might do or how you'd react. But Leo doesn't have time for me to be afraid anymore." "What does that mean?" Miles asked, his stomach sinking. "He's sick," she said, her voice cracking. "A genetic disorder. It's rare and it's progressive. Without your help he won't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Miles felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the photograph again, at the boy who might be his son, and for the first time he felt the weight of something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine, the possibility of being a father, and with it came a terrifying realization. If he truly was Leo's father, then he couldn't walk away, not from this. The drive back to his penthouse felt like an eternity. Miles sat in the backseat of his car, the folder of documents clutched tightly in his hands. The city's vibrant streets blurred past the window, but his mind was elsewhere, locked on the photograph of Leo and the woman's haunting words. "He needs you." Miles had built his life around control. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was calculated. Yet for the first time in years, he felt completely untethered. The idea of having a child, a son, was something he'd long since buried. After countless failed fertility treatments and the quiet dissolution of his engagement years ago, he'd convinced himself that fatherhood simply wasn't in the cards. And now, out of nowhere, he was being told he already had a child, a boy with his eyes and his DNA. By the time he arrived home, the folder felt heavier than it had before. Miles set it on his desk, staring at it like it might explode. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and took a long sip, letting the warmth steady his nerves. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the folder again. The medical records were the first thing he read. Leo had been diagnosed with a rare mitochondrial disorder, something that caused progressive muscle weakness, fatigue, and a host of other symptoms. The notes described experimental treatments and clinical trials, none of which had yielded significant results. The prognosis was grim. Miles felt a pang of guilt as he realized he'd been questioning the woman's motives. This wasn't some elaborate ploy for money. It was something far more desperate. Then there was the DNA test, with its irrefutable match. The numbers didn't lie. Leo was his biological son. The next morning, Miles's assistant, Rachel, greeted him with her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Atwood," she said, handing him a schedule for the day. "Your 10 a.m. board meeting has been moved to 11. And there's a request from—" "Cancel everything," Miles interrupted, his tone curt. Rachel blinked in surprise. "Everything?" "Yes, I'll be out for the day. Reschedule whatever you need to." Before she could protest, Miles was already out the door, his coat slung over his arm. He had a single destination in mind, the woman from St. Helena's Garden. Finding her proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. She had given him no contact information, no way to follow up. All he had was a first name, Emma, and the faint hope that she might still be in the vicinity of the park. Hours later, frustration was mounting. Miles had exhausted every possible lead, but Emma seemed to have vanished as quickly as she'd appeared. He was about to give up, when a soft voice called out behind him. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Miles turned to see Emma standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. Her hood was down this time, revealing a delicate face framed by waves of auburn hair. There was a guardedness in her expression, but also a flicker of relief. "You didn't leave me much choice," Miles said, striding toward her. "You dropped a bombshell on me and then disappeared. I need answers." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough, but not here. Follow me." They ended up in a quiet cafe a few blocks from the park. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as they sat at a small table in the corner. Emma seemed tense, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her cup. Miles, on the other hand, was impatient. Start from the beginning, he said. Who are you? And how did this happen? Emma took a deep breath before answering. I was a research assistant at Helix Labs, working under Dr. Marcus Vinton. He was a pioneer in genetic engineering, obsessed with pushing the boundaries of science. Most of the work we did was legitimate, groundbreaking even, but there were always whispers about his side projects. What kind of side projects? Miles asked, his voice sharp. The kind that skirted the edges of ethics, Emma admitted. He was fascinated by the idea of creating perfect genetic matches. One day I stumbled across a file with your name on it. I didn't think much of it at first. You were a public figure and it wasn't unusual for companies to study the DNA of influential people. But then I found something else. A fertilization record. Miles felt his stomach turn. Are you saying he stole my DNA? Emma nodded. I don't know how he got it, but he used it to create an embryo. It was implanted into a surrogate, an anonymous woman. She was told it was part of a trial, but she had no idea whose genetic material was involved. 9 months later, Leo was born. The weight of her words settled over him like a dark cloud. Miles clenched his fists, struggling to process the violation. And you knew about this? You let it happen? I didn't know the full extent until it was too late, Emma said, her voice breaking. When I found out, I tried to stop him, but I didn't have the power to go up against him. And when I realized what kind of condition Leo had, I couldn't just walk away. What do you mean? Miles asked, his gaze narrowing. I quit the lab and took Leo in, Emma said. I've been raising him as my own ever since. Miles stared at her, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to be angry, but the more he looked at Emma, the more he saw the strain she carried. This wasn't just his burden, it was hers too. And now you're here because you need my help, Miles said, his tone softer. Emma nodded. Leo's condition is genetic. It comes from your side. If we're going to save him, we need you. Miles leaned back in his chair, the enormity of the situation crashing down on him. What kind of help are we talking about? Helix Labs has been developing a treatment, Emma explained. It's experimental, but it's the best chance we have. The problem is it requires your genetic material to complete. Miles raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to work with the same people who stole from me? Emma shook her head. Not Helix. There's another lab, a competitor, willing to take on the project, but they need funding and access to you. Miles let out a bitter laugh. So, you want me to bankroll this? Not just that, Emma said quietly. They need your DNA, your direct involvement. For a moment, Miles said nothing. He stared out the window, his mind racing. Everything in him screamed to walk away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this mess. But then he thought of Leo, the boy with his eyes, and the idea of doing nothing felt unbearable. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. But on one condition. Emma looked at him warily. What condition? I want to meet him, Miles said. If I'm going to do this, I need to meet my son. Emma hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded. Okay, but you have to understand. He doesn't know who you are. To him, I'm his mother and his only parent. It's going to be a lot for him to process. I'll handle it, Miles said. Just tell me where and when. That evening, Miles found himself standing outside a modest apartment building in Brooklyn. It was a far cry from his usual surroundings. No marble floors, no doorman, no luxury cars lined up outside. Yet, as he followed Emma up the narrow staircase, he felt an unfamiliar nervousness take hold. Inside the apartment, Leo was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a sea of toy dinosaurs. He looked up as they entered, his eyes bright with curiosity. Leo, Emma said gently, this is Mr. Atwood. He's a friend. Leo stood up, clutching a T-Rex in one hand. Hi, he said shyly. Miles crouched down to his level, feeling a lump form in his throat. Hi, Leo. For a moment they just looked at each other, and in that silence something shifted. Miles felt an ache he couldn't quite name, a sense of connection he hadn't expected. Leo smiled, and in that instant Miles knew he'd made the right choice. The sound of Leo's laughter filled the small apartment, a melody that seemed to ease the weight on Miles's shoulders, if only for a moment. The boy was showing him his prized dinosaur collection, eagerly pointing out the different species, with the unbridled enthusiasm of a 5-year-old. This one's a triceratops, Leo said, holding up a green plastic figure. It's my favorite because it has 3 horns. Did you know it used them to fight T-Rex? Miles nodded. though he couldn't help but marvel at the boy's energy. It was hard to reconcile this lively child with the grim prognosis in the medical files he'd read. Leo was animated, curious and sharp, qualities Miles couldn't ignore. Emma watched the two of them from the kitchen, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. There was a cautiousness in her expression, as though she were still deciding whether allowing this meeting had been a mistake. "Leo," she said finally, "why don't you go wash up? It's almost time for dinner." Leo pouted, but obeyed, clutching his dinosaur as he disappeared down the hallway. Once he was out of earshot, Emma turned to Miles. "You handled that better than I expected," she said, her tone neutral. "Don't sound so surprised," Miles replied, though there was a hint of humor in his voice. "I've been around kids before." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Corporate fundraisers with a photo op mascot don't count." Miles didn't respond. Instead, he leaned against the back of the couch, his gaze fixed on the hallway where Leo had disappeared. "He's amazing," he said quietly. Emma softened, her guard lowering just slightly. "He is," she admitted. "But his illness, it's not always this easy. Some days he can't even get out of bed, and it's only going to get worse." Her words hit Miles like a punch to the gut. He thought back to the tests, the charts detailing Leo's condition. The disorder was relentless, chipping away at the boy's strength little by little. Miles clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "What do we need to do to save him?" he asked, his voice steady. Emma hesitated, then motioned for him to follow her. They moved to a small office at the back of the apartment, where she pulled out a laptop and opened a folder filled with documents. Diagrams, research proposals, and funding estimates filled the screen. "This is the lab I told you about," she said, pointing to a logo in the corner of the screen. "Gene Core Innovations. They've been working on a therapy that could potentially repair the damaged mitochondria causing Leo's condition. It's still in the experimental phase, but they're willing to fast-track it if we provide the resources." Miles studied the screen, his sharp mind already calculating the logistics. "How much are we talking?" "5 million, Emma said without hesitation. "That covers the research, the trials, and the first round of treatment. It's a lot, but—" "I'll write the check," Miles interrupted. Emma stared at him, stunned. "Just like that?" "Money isn't the issue," Miles said firmly. "But this isn't just about funding. You said they need my DNA. What does that process look like?" Emma nodded, pulling up another document. "It's not invasive. They'll take a sample, blood or saliva, and use it to synthesize the necessary proteins for the therapy. It's straightforward." Miles leaned back in the chair, considering her words. The plan seemed feasible, but the risks lingered in the back of his mind. If GeneCore was willing to fast-track the treatment, it meant there were unknowns, variables they hadn't accounted for, and when it came to Leo, Miles wasn't willing to gamble on uncertainty. "When can we start?" he asked. Emma hesitated. "There's one more thing you need to know." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miles stared at her, his patience wearing thin. "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the desk. "Dr. Vinton," she said finally. "He's involved in this." Miles froze. "The same Dr. Vinton who created Leo without my knowledge?" Emma nodded. "He's a consultant for GeneCore. I didn't want to tell you because I was afraid you'd back out. But the truth is, he's one of the few people with the expertise to make this work." Miles's jaw tightened. The name alone was enough to ignite his anger. Dr. Marcus Vinton represented everything Miles despised: arrogance, manipulation, and a blatant disregard for ethics. The idea of working with him was unthinkable. "No," Miles said, his tone icy. "Find someone else." "There isn't anyone else," Emma said, her voice rising. "You think I like this? You think I want to rely on him? But this isn't about us, Miles. It's about Leo." Miles opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Emma's eyes stopped him. She was desperate, not for herself, but for the boy they both wanted to save. It was a sobering reminder of what was at stake. "Fine," Miles said through gritted teeth. "I'll tolerate Vinton, but the second he steps out of line, he's gone." Emma nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Miles threw his resources into the project, arranging meetings with GeneCore's executives and ensuring every aspect of the treatment was expedited. Emma worked alongside him, her knowledge of the science proving invaluable. Despite their differences, they found a strange rhythm united by their shared goal. But as the days passed, Miles found himself drawn to more than just the mission. He started noticing the little things about Emma, the way she bit her lip when she was deep in thought, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about Leo, the quiet strength she carried even in the face of overwhelming odds. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, they found themselves alone in the conference room. Emma was scribbling notes on a whiteboard, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. Miles watched her for a moment, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said. Emma turned, startled. "What? You've done all of this on your own," Miles continued. "Raising Leo, fighting for him. I don't know how you've managed it." Emma's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "I didn't have a choice." "That doesn't make it any less remarkable," Miles said softly. For a moment their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to shift. But before either of them could say anything, Emma cleared her throat and turned back to the whiteboard. "We should focus on the timeline," she said, her voice brisk. Miles nodded, though the moment lingered in his mind long after they'd gone their separate ways. Finally, the day arrived for the first stage of the treatment. Miles and Emma stood side by side in Gene Corps' sterile lab, watching as the technicians prepared the equipment. Leo sat in a nearby chair, his legs swinging nervously. "Will it hurt?" Leo asked, his voice small. "No, sweetheart," Emma said, kneeling beside him. "It's just like a little pinch." Leo nodded, though he still looked apprehensive. Miles crouched down, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're the bravest kid I've ever met," Miles said. "And after this, you're going to feel so much better." Leo looked up at him, his expression softening. "Promise?" "I promise," Miles said, his voice firm. The procedure itself was uneventful, a simple injection that took less than a minute, but the aftermath was anything but. As the treatment began to take effect, Leo's body reacted in unexpected ways. His temperature spiked, his breathing grew labored, and alarms blared throughout the lab. "What's happening?" Miles demanded, his voice rising. Dr. Vinton stepped forward, his expression calm but tense. "It's a normal reaction," he said. "The therapy is targeting the defective cells. His body just needs time to adjust." Emma looked at him, her face pale. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Vinton said firmly, "but we'll monitor him closely to be safe." Miles wanted to trust him, but the sight of Leo struggling was almost too much to bear. He turned to Emma, his voice low. "If anything happens to him, Vinton answers to me." Hours passed before Leo's condition stabilized. By the time he was back to his cheerful self, Miles felt like he'd aged a decade. But the relief on Emma's face made it all worth it. "Thank you," she said quietly as they watched Leo sleep. "For everything." Miles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "We're in this together," he said, and for the first time in years, Miles felt like he truly meant it. The days following Leo's first treatment were a whirlwind of cautious hope and unrelenting tension. Though his body had reacted violently at first, the boy had shown remarkable improvement in the weeks that followed. His energy levels were higher, his episodes of fatigue less frequent, and for the first time in months he was able to run without collapsing. Miles watched Leo chase a kite through the park, his laughter ringing out like a bell. The sound stirred something deep within him, a mixture of pride, relief, and something he couldn't quite name. He'd never expected to feel this way about anyone, let alone a boy he'd only recently discovered. But now, the idea of life without Leo felt unthinkable. Emma stood beside him, her eyes glued to the boy as he sprinted across the grass. "It's incredible, isn't it?" she said softly. "To see him like this." "It is," Miles agreed, "but it's only the beginning. We can't afford to get complacent." Emma nodded, her expression clouding with concern. "I know. The treatment's working, but it's not a cure. We're going to need more rounds, more research. And we'll get it," Miles said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Emma turned to him, her gaze searching. "Why are you doing this, Miles? It's not just about Leo, is it?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It is about Leo," he said, "but it's also about me. I've spent my entire life building things, companies, legacies, walls. None of it mattered, not really, but this, he matters." Emma's expression softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The connection between them had grown in ways neither of them had anticipated, and though neither dared to name it, the bond was undeniable. Back at Gene Corps, the second round of treatment loomed. The stakes were higher this time. Vinton had explained that this phase would be more aggressive, targeting the deeper layers of Leo's condition. There was hope for progress, but also a risk of complications. Miles didn't like risks, but for Leo, he would take them all. The morning of the procedure, Leo was uncharacteristically quiet. He sat in the waiting room, clutching his favorite dinosaur, his feet swinging nervously. Miles sat beside him, doing his best to project calm. "You know what I used to do when I was scared?" Miles asked. Leo looked up at him, wide-eyed. "What?" "I'd pretend I was a superhero," Miles said. "Superheroes get scared too, but they don't let it stop them. They do what needs to be done because it's the right thing." Leo considered this, then nodded. "Can I be a superhero too?" "You already are," Miles said, ruffling his hair. Emma watched the exchange from across the room, her chest tightening. She'd been the one constant in Leo's life for so long, but seeing him with Miles was a revelation. The boy had found something in him that Emma couldn't provide, a sense of protection, of belonging. The procedure itself was grueling. Leo's small body trembled as the treatment coursed through him, his face pale and slick with sweat. Miles and Emma stood just outside the observation room, helpless to do anything but watch. "How much longer?" Emma asked, her voice tight. Vinton glanced at the monitor. "Another 20 minutes. He's responding well, but we're pushing his limits." Miles's fists clenched. "You said this would be safe." "It is," Vinton replied calmly. "But no treatment is without challenges. Trust me, Mr. Atwood, this is the only way." Miles glared at him but said nothing. His attention was fixed on Leo, whose small frame seemed almost swallowed by the medical equipment. The boy's bravery was staggering, and Miles felt a surge of both admiration and guilt. Leo was enduring all of this because of choices Miles hadn't even known were being made. When the procedure finally ended, the relief was palpable. Leo was wheeled into recovery, his breathing shallow but steady. Emma rushed to his side, brushing a hand through his damp hair. "You did so good, sweetheart," she murmured. "I'm so proud of you." Miles stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes scanning the monitors. "What now?" he asked Vinton. "Now we wait," the doctor said. "The next 48 hours are critical. If his body adapts to the treatment, we should start seeing improvements within a week." "And if it doesn't?" Miles asked, his voice low. Vinton hesitated. "Then we reevaluate." Miles didn't like the ambiguity, but he didn't press further. For now, all that mattered was giving Leo the best chance possible. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Emma refused to leave Leo's side, while Miles paced the small hospital room, his mind racing with contingency plans. Late that night, as the city's lights twinkled outside the window, Emma finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what happens after all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miles stopped pacing, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "Assuming the treatment works," Emma said, "and Leo gets better, what then? Do you go back to your world, and we go back to ours?" The question caught Miles off guard. He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. But now that Emma had voiced it, the thought was impossible to ignore. He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, and realized he didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not walking away. Not from him. Not from you." Emma's breath caught, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around them. But before she could respond, a small voice interrupted. "Mom? Miles?" They turned to see Leo stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Relief flooded through both of them as they rushed to his side. "I'm here, sweetheart," Emma said, taking his hand. "Me too," Miles added, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "How are you feeling?" Leo smiled weakly. "Like a superhero." Miles laughed, the sound tinged with emotion. "That's because you are one." Over the next few weeks, Leo's condition improved in ways neither Emma nor Miles had dared to hope. He regained strength, his color returned, and for the first time in months, he started playing without needing to rest every few minutes. Miles made a point of being there for every milestone. He took Leo to museums, taught him how to fly a kite, and even endured a surprisingly competitive game of Monopoly. For Miles, these moments were more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed. But with each passing day, the bond between Miles and Emma also deepened. They found comfort in each other's presence, a sense of partnership that went beyond their shared mission. And though neither of them said it aloud, the unspoken truth was clear. They weren't just fighting for Leo, they were building something together. One evening, as they sat on the apartment balcony watching the sunset, Emma finally spoke the words that had been lingering in her mind. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Even with everything we've done, I'm scared it won't be enough." Miles reached over, taking her hand in his. "I am too," he said, "but we're not done fighting, and we're not alone." Emma looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you, Miles, for everything." He squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "You don't have to thank me. I'm where I'm supposed to be." The final round of treatment came 6 months later. By then, Leo's progress had exceeded expectations, and the doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. But the day still carried an air of gravity, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd risked. Miles and Emma stood together as the doctors prepped Leo for the procedure. The boy was calm, his trust in them unwavering. "Are you scared?" Miles asked him. Leo shook his head. "Not when you're here." Miles smiled, his chest tightening. "I'll always be here, buddy, I promise." The treatment was a success. For the first time, the doctors declared Leo in remission, his condition stabilized. The news was met with tears, laughter, and a wave of relief so profound it left them all breathless. That night, as they celebrated with pizza and ice cream, Leo fell asleep on the couch, his dinosaur tucked under his arm. Miles and Emma sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "We did it," Emma said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Miles nodded. "No, he did it. We just helped." Emma smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem so daunting. They had faced the impossible and won, and in the process they'd found something even more unexpected: a family. Months later, as Leo sprinted across a sandy beach, his laughter carried on the wind, Miles and Emma watched from the shore. Their hands were intertwined, their hearts lighter than they'd been in years. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Emma asked, her tone playful. Miles chuckled. "Every day, but I wouldn't change a thing." Emma smiled, leaning into him. "Me neither." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Miles realized something he never thought possible. For the first time in his life, he felt whole. And as Leo called out to them, waving excitedly from the water, Miles knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just a CEO or a billionaire anymore. He was a father, and that was all that mattered.